That's about it. Any concerns, questions, anything? Everybody's seen their questions. I'm not actually more. I'm not sure. Shall we go already? So maybe if we have panel one sit up here, just so we're faster, more prepared. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to sit there just taking some water.
Okay, I think we can expect maybe a few more people to come in after having a coffee after their other long last session. So let's see how we proceed. But for time-wise, we are stuck with time. We've got the running up against the last plenary session today, so we'll have to get through this hopefully on time. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming here and attending this session. It's a session that's on a dialogue around the nationally determined contributions and climate action roadmaps. I'm Steve Kroski. I work for United Nations Office of Project Services, UNOPS. We're the implementing arm of the UN. And I'll talk a little bit about, at the end, some of the work that we're doing with the Global ABC and others around this. I'm going to be very brief. I think we all realize how urgent action needs to be taken. I think we all understand that this is an urgent topic of conversation. We know that climate action we need to accelerate climate action, and we need to do it now. We know that currently buildings and construction sector is not really is a key sector for climate action, but is not really included in many NDCs. Only 34 countries have roadmaps for accelerating action around the buildings and construction sector. So never a better time to have a conversation around this and to bring together a really diverse and interesting panel of people together to discuss this topic. First off, we're going to have a keynote speech from a representative UNFCCC. So maybe I'll give up the floor to Lola Vallejo, the co-chair of the Mitigation Work Programme for UNFCCC and Climate Programme, Director of the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. Thank you, Lola.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here because we're going to talk both about ambition and implementation, and we know that we're falling short on both. We both need ambition, NDCs that aim higher, but also actual efforts to meet what is on paper. I'll say just a line about what the Mitigation Work Programme is. It's a very new forum and process within the international climate negotiation, kick-started at COP26, adopted at COP27, and last year was our first year of operation. I co-chair this process with Amr Abdelaziz from Egypt, And last year we held discussions around the theme of just energy transition. So we're complementary to, dialogues that can be done, for instance, on the request of the COP28 presidency with the support of the IEA, and that has been very important in driving everyone's attention towards the energy outcome that we had at last COP. But I'm here because our theme for this year is about cities, buildings, and urban systems, which means that when you leave this conference and you are not sure when is going to be the next meeting or the next time to take that forward at the international scale, I would urge you all to look out for the next global dialogue that we will organize probably at the end of May in Bonn, just before the SB's session. Just to explain, we're focusing on low-hanging fruits and scale. Our focus is really on the emergency of this critical decade, but because it's under UNFCCC process, we're trying to do different things, both review progress and understand what worked for developed countries, but also we're very much geared towards providing support to developing countries and understanding how can they get support for the skills, the finance, the technology that they need. This is something that is very important in everything that we do. One thing that I'm asking all of you is, if you're an expert, please, participate in those dialogues. You can be nominated by countries. If you're a government official, please, turn to the foreign affairs official that is in charge of nominating experts and government officials for these dialogues, and make sure that we have a discussion that really builds on all the substance that you guys are doing in different contexts, because this will really enhance the richness of our discussions. I would also try and entice you by saying, what can this deliver for this conversation that we're having in these 2 days? I would wager that we can try and do 2 things. First, I was really inspired by the Chaillot Declaration, because it's got a fairly broad support base, and it's also clearly building on a range of very different stakeholders. But maybe the mitigation work program can be a vehicle through which you can hope to see some of those maybe echoing in the context of international climate negotiation. And we have, by the end of the year, to support the elaboration of a COP decision. So maybe, through your help and through your engagement through this process, we could have the international negotiations also reflecting some of the work and some of the momentum that we're having in these 2 days. And we can also be a space where we continue these discussions that are so important about how to enhance the NDCs and how to make sure that they are more than just the paper they're written on, but that are also geared towards implementation. So I look forward to hearing both panels and connecting with every one of you in support of this new forum, and hoping that we can make a dent in this great challenge. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Lola. And as we're trying to do more and more now, these calls to actions are important, and being more involved and getting involved is key. We're going to move now to our first panel, and I'm going to just introduce the panel very briefly, and then we're going to go do a quick question and answer session with everybody. So the first panel here, we're going to be examining how and why buildings should be included, and how the use of roadmaps help set visionary objectives. It's the topic of this first panel. We've got Nasiba Al-Marzouki, the Director at the Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure for the UAE. Thank you. Peter Graham, Executive Director, Global Buildings Programme Network. Azmiri Ashrafi, Member Secretary of the Technical Committee of the Bangladesh Ministry of Housing and Public Works. Ksenia Petruchenko, Buildings Lead for the International Energy Agency. Giampiero Naci, Director, Sustainable Business and Infrastructure for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So over to you 5, and I'm going to lead the first question, which will be to UAE representatives. So, NDCs are leading the way in terms of having concrete, measurable and quantifiable targets for building and construction, some of which include the cutting of emissions in the building sector by 56% by 2030. Do you have any advice for other countries on how you did this and how they can integrate strong actions and ambitions targets for the sector and their NDCs? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for hosting us, and I'm honored to represent UAE in this Global Forum for Climate and Building. Before I talk about the advice that we can share with the best practice we've done when we structured the NDC within the UAE, I just want to give you a brief about the NDCs, the third updates of the second National Determination Contribution for UAE, and the title of Accelerating Actions Toward Green and Inclusive and Resilient Economy. The country effort to reduce emission have accelerated, and updated NDC outlined plans for further initiatives. UAE's updated NDC shows that we are taking GHG reduction seriously, and we understand that we cannot achieve net zero by 2030 if we don't have bold intermediate targets. That's why we announced our 2030 targets in the third NDC's update by sectorial targets for all domestic sectors, such as the power and water generation, and heavy industry, transportation, waste, and agriculture, and for sure the building sector, which has the highest targets among all of them. Our advice to others is, first, you have to set up a sectorial targets, and built environment should be one of them, as all of us we know that it is about 40% of the emissions worldwide. And secondly is to set an intermediate ambitions targets, because that is the way to ensure that we are at the right track to net zero. Today is time to act, as we don't have the luxury of time to lose. And thirdly and last, we all learn from each other. And I think by using the platform, such as like Global ABC platform, it's a good tool to exchange knowledge, experience, and technologies to support our targets achievement. So let's use these targets and these platforms for the achievement of all the targets we are aiming to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nasiba. Very, very interesting takeaways from that, I think. Next question is going to Ksenia. The IEA has done a lot of work on the roadmaps with Global ABC, from the original global and regional Global ABC roadmaps to sub-regional ASEAN and national roadmaps, e.g. India. Why do you think that roadmaps are important for countries? How can they support them for updating their NDCs? And why should NDCs be updated to include buildings? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very great question. We indeed have been working with a number of countries, and also JBC is our very close partner. So we took the methodology which is developed for roadmaps and adapted to some of our targeted countries, specifically ASEAN region. So we have 2 roadmaps available for ASEAN region on buildings and construction, and the other one on sustainable cooling. So it's not a national level roadmap, but for the whole region. And as you know, ASEAN region is quite diverse, but still the development of this roadmap using one very clear but also flexible methodology with several focus areas allowed to create the shared vision for the region, and also look at specific context and diversity within the region. So I think the importance of the roadmap is to really bring stakeholders on board and create the vision and kind of backcast what we call starting from net zero emissions, which can be a point in time different for every country depending on their local context and conditions, and backcast to the present moment looking at the current situation in each country, looking at current political environment, existing policies, challenges, barriers for energy efficiency, and identify what are the key milestones, what is the map, how we can get from the present moment to a certain point in the future which can bring us to net zero. What are the timelines for that, and how we also heard what would be, what do we want to achieve, for example, in a very short term, within 1 or 2 years, and in mid-term, for example, by 2030. So in those roadmaps, you will see that we have those milestones and timelines identified based on the current situation in the region. But also, very importantly, they allow us to link the milestones to the actual policy development. So at IEA, we always say there is no one silver bullet to address all the issues and barriers for energy efficiency. We really need a policy package approach. So we integrated a policy package approach into the roadmap development. And when we think about milestones and how do we get to those milestones, we identify specific policy instruments, be it regulatory instruments, financial and non-financial incentives, and information mechanisms, which can work together to bring us closer to achieving those intermediate targets and ultimately moving towards net zero. So answering the second part of your question, how that can support NDCs, I think it can give really strong basis for identifying targets that ultimately get us in, can be included into NDC, because any development of NDC needs to start with analysis of the situation in the country, identification of what data is available, what are the key barriers, what are the opportunities and challenges for each country, and how do we set the target, which is measurable but also ambitious and realistic to achieve. So the roadmaps can provide this basis, can identify the mechanisms for achieving this target, and also set the base for example, for implementation plan as well. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. Thank you. Peter, your turn. You've done a lot of work supporting governments to develop their own priorities for their NDCs. Can you please tell us about the tools and approaches you used to develop these priorities?
Yes.
How did you ensure that they could be implemented and
yes,
fundable?
Yes. Thank you. I think the main message that I would like to leave you with today is that we have a lot of tools, a lot of guidelines, and a lot of experience to support countries to set ambitious goals and include them in their NDCs and roadmaps. And I'd like to perhaps look at this in terms of what time we have left to get these NDCs up to scratch. So really we're engaged in a process of reviewing the NDCs now. And we want to see all countries have ambitious, Paris-aligned goals for their building sector in the next round of NDCs. And we want to see that countries are starting to implement those actions by 2030, so that we're actually then on that track to decarbonisation by 2050. Have confidence that if you're ambitious and you kind of accept this timeline, that there are the tools and methods available. So let me give you some examples. We need to start with a clear political commitment in an NDC. So in 2022, the Global ABC commissioned GBPN and the Monash University to try and come up with an understanding of what makes a good NDC for the building sector. So we called these front-runner commitment descriptions. So what are these? A front-runner commitment aims to achieve an emission reduction goal that's aligned with the Paris Agreement, links sub-national action and national ambition, including adaptation, expresses an implementation pathway or a roadmap, and is based on stakeholder engagement, very importantly. There's 11 criteria that can be used to frame and draft an NDC, which is going to make a difference. And in fact, UAE was one of the countries which participated in that as an initial front runner. But when you've got the template, you still need to develop the actions. And in 2019, we supported the development of a guide for incorporating buildings actions in NDCs. And this guide is based on a very simple stakeholder-driven approach of engaging stakeholders in local coalitions, working with them to collect the data and map what's going on, use that information to help the implementers set the priorities that would possibly go into a roadmap, and then develop an implementation plan that, or at least facilitate the development of an implementation plan that's driven from the bottom up. So the people who actually have to make the changes are the ones that are designing the pathway forward. So these guidelines exist, and even following on from that, we worked with the Partnership for Energy Efficient Buildings, PEEB, to develop a toolkit for developing NDC actions building sector actions in roadmaps and NDCs as well. So this is an alignment of resources and organisations and tools that can help countries to actually take the steps that I just outlined before. So there's a whole architecture of support for incorporating ambitious Paris-aligned commitments into the NDCs. So let's take that next step. We have what we need to begin. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Very good. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next one now. Giampiero, as a development bank representative, can you please tell us why it's important for countries to have clear priorities and targets for development banks to prioritise investments in green buildings and construction? And maybe you could also give us an example of how you plan on using roadmaps, if you do.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the question, and thank you for having me here. Let me start just by framing, if you like, the problem. The DBRD, but also that's the role of most of the multilateral development banks. We work primarily in emerging markets and developing, economies. So that's our space, and there we play a role. Just maybe trying to define the problem. We see in the building sector, three main issues. One is inadequate, insufficient, sometimes asymmetric, policy and regulatory environment, which gives often, mixed signals to the investors and to the project developers. There is also an element of short-termism. We see a lot of, for example, budget allocation policies that create expectation in terms of grants, in terms of concessional money, that often then don't create a stable flow of activity and investments. And also asymmetries between different policies. Think about the industrial policy, the climate policy. This is driven by the fact that a lot of activities are developed in parallel, and the policy setup, is not, if you like, coherent. So going back to your question, absolutely, it's absolutely critical to have clear signals, long-term signals, in terms of what are the ambitions, what are the aspirations. Because ultimately, the result of this, situation is that in the building sector in particular, it's very difficult to find bankable projects. It's an element of there's a problem of supply of bankable investment. We talk a lot about green finance, climate finance, but ultimately, finance is there. The issue is that it's very difficult to link, if you like, the financing available and shaping financial instrument that actually can find a suitable, return. So that's the problem. So clearly, it's very important to provide these policy signals. And this has two dimensions. One, in the policy space, indeed, it's about the synchronization with the climate ambition, with the overall direction of travel that the country wants to embrace. But it's also about the interdependencies with industrial policy, for example, or the energy policy. And this is critical to optimize, if you like, the location of resources and the interventions. In turn, these allow organizations like the multilateral development banks, but also all development agencies, to work more effectively with government, with civil society, with investors, with industry, and shape programs that try to address some of the issues. And I give you a bit of a list of why this is important. If you set up these long-term objectives and mandate, these ultimately allow to work together and try to drive a convergence between the project developers, the technology providers, the investors, in terms of what are the technical solutions needed, what is the size of the investments required, and also in terms of the timing of these investments. There is an element of aligning the investments and finance. That's what MDBs typically do. Work with government, working with the local financial sector, and shaping the instruments and think about the green capital markets that can feed finance to the projects. There is also an element of optimizing the delivery channels. At EBRD, but this is true for all other development agencies. We're looking at expanding as much as possible the way to link finance to investments. We use the local financial sector, dedicated credit lines. We use utilities. We use construction companies. So only if you have these long-term objectives set, you can shape and optimize these elements. Then there's, of course, the identification of policy roadblocks. What are the trigger points that ultimately trigger a market transformation and provide a clear market signal? But there is also the issue about risk. Ultimately, finance, it's about pricing risk, right? And clearly, if there is a long-term aspiration and direction of travel, that's what development banks, commercial banks can do, help understanding the risks and provide the financial solutions. And last but not least, this is the only way to attract private capital in the long term. It's about creating the market signals, the market instruments. And this is the only solution to address the problem of both mitigation and adaptation in the building sector. The public finance, MDB finance will always be largely insufficient. So only by finding ways of attracting private capital, we can address the problem at scale. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Very clear, thank you. So now we're going to turn to Azmeri Ashrafi for a last question of this round. As a country that's currently developing its roadmap, what were some of the largest challenges you are facing in the creation of this roadmap?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak something about my country. As you know, Bangladesh is one of the challenging countries that are really have so much issues about the climate change impact, mostly in negative way due to their geographical locations, and the highest elevation of the country is only 10 meters. So even the small sea level rise, it impacts a lot to the country. So with the initiatives of UNOPS and UNEP and Uninhabited, we're implementing and going to prepare the roadmaps to decarbonization in the building and construction sector, which has been a bit neglected in the country because most of the time we have NDCs, we have different kind of strategic policies, we have building codes, we have green building guidelines. We recently, Bangladesh government also prepared the MOSIP Climate Action Plan for 2022 to 2041, but still those strategies are not actually a comprehensive. It's like mostly focused on the renewable energy and mostly operational building things. And it's a very less importance has been given on the adaptation, mostly focused on the mitigation. So when we are doing the different kind of workshops, as you say, that engagement of the civil society and the stakeholders, especially the industrialists and the engineer professionals, engineers, academicians, and also the landowners, the house owners, involvement of them is very important. So when we did that, we found that we have lots of policies, we have lots of institutions, but the main problem is coordination among them. And so we need a proper coordination, and we need a comprehensive plans who can really make a total circulation thing. So it would be easier for us to have one goal, one target for the whole country who is covering all sectors of the probable emissions, so that we can ultimately achieve it in a comprehensive way and achieve the target to minimize the carbon emissions or greenhouse emissions from all sectors, all probable sectors of the country. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Azmeri. I can see that, and time-wise as well, it might be worth actually just dwelling on a couple of points, because there's a lot of key messages appearing from all of you in terms of coherence, policy coherence. And I think it was interesting, yesterday we had a session where Costa Rica put something up on the board to show how many ministries and the stakeholders had to bring together to have a discussion about the building sector. UAE, you mentioned about the fact you're not just doing the building sector, you're looking across infrastructure sectors, which is even wider and more complex. So the sort of coherence across governments and government departments, the coherence between government, private sector, civil society, financing instruments and bodies, etc., is obviously a key challenge that's emerging. I think from all of you are picking up on this. We've got a couple of minutes now. I'm just wondering, rather than running through a few questions, it might be worth opening up the floor a little bit. Have you got one or two questions that anybody would like to ask the panel from the floor, from what you've heard at this point? I'd like to get you engaged a bit, a little bit. Any questions, any thoughts? Okay.
I'm just wondering about, the update of the NDC cycle and the 2025 sort of target that we're working towards in Brazil. I'm just be interested to get your reflections on what are the kind of opportunities to enhance action in the NDCs up to then. I guess it's another question to everyone.
Would anybody like to take that, or even Lola as well, if you'd like to?
Big question.
Yeah.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, goodness me.
No.
Sitting in the middle of the room.
Fighting for it.
Okay, I will take that question on. There is no choice, really. We have to make sure that effective Paris-aligned commitments are in the NDCs. How to do it quickly? I think our approach is, what we found successful, I suppose, is you can have a top-down approach which sort of clarifies the alignment between different ministries and what the priorities are in terms of emission reduction and adaptation and that sort of thing. But you must engage from the bottom up. You must be talking at the subnational level to the implementers of the plan and involving them in developing the plan. I think roadmaps, we've seen successful roadmap development and implementation where stakeholder engagement and stakeholder involvement has been the driving force. And we've seen roadmaps fail to get traction when it's been too top-down and sort of consultant-led. But I think getting to 2025, what I'm looking at now is we could probably develop a template for an ambitious NDC description from what we already know, and then that could be adapted with local stakeholders to get the vision statement right. And then you've got time to develop the implementation pathways with the stakeholders, once that commitment's in place. But for a lot of, you mentioned finance, and it's the same with NGOs, we're kind of waiting for that political commitment. So, and once we know we've got the mandate, then we can get the philanthropic funding, and there's also more certainty for market players.
Can I maybe also just maybe give a concrete example, because ultimately I completely agree with Peter's point. I'll give you the example of a work we have done for several years, including with other development partners in Uzbekistan, right? So it's a country where until a few years ago there was literally zero capacity, renewable energy capacity, right? And rightly so, because it was very difficult for the government to understand the implications, how to scale up that sector. So we worked together with them in low carbon pathways for the electricity sector. So that allowed them to understand that ultimately there were certain steps they could do in the relatively short term. In fact, they set up an initial target of 6 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity by 2030, right? Then, after completing this work, we worked on actually some piece of regulation, so how to launch renewable energy auctions. This was quite successful. There were a number of international investors that came in from different countries. So they realized actually they could absorb more capacity. In fact, they doubled the renewable energy target. And by continuing this policy engagement, so anyway, just to cut it short, now they have a 25 gigawatt target by 2035. So really, it's very difficult for countries to set up ambition unless there is a clear understanding of the implication, interdependencies between different sectors, and also the analytical work and the data that support the decision, inform the decision. So totally agree with your point on. And this is also what helps the MDBs to shape the financial approaches, the policy support, and all the rest that is needed to unlock the market opportunities.
Sorry, I need to follow up because, very quickly, starting where you can start is very important as well. So we're working in Indonesia at the moment on the National Green Building Roadmap, which has been something which we hope will end up informing an NDC commitment. But basically, what we started with was where a local government in that case was ready to set a target. And it wasn't near zero, I think, to your point. It was something that we could show progress on, and that motivates. You know, you can see progress, you motivate, and that project scaled up from one city to now the national roadmap. So the next step for us, it's really flipped it, is to now be able to talk to Indonesia about, well, that can go in the NDC. You know, but it's sort of coming from a really confident basis that we're actually building on achievement, not making some broad vision statement.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, and I would love to, because we could do this, I think, for hours, and we probably should be doing this for a long time, having this dialogue. Unfortunately, we've got to segue now also into what the second session is going to be around, and that's the challenges in implementing these roadmaps. But unfortunately, we're going to have to say thank you so much to the 5 panel participants, bringing all of your knowledge and experience and having these discussions with us. So thank you very much, and we're going to have to move on to panel 2, I'm afraid. So, but thank you. So, as I mentioned, we're really now going to be moving on to the panel session number 2, which is exploring the challenges and implementation of the achievements, the objectives outlined in NDCs and the roadmaps. So I'm going to call up to the stage the next 5 panel members, starting off with Professor Halil Hasar. Professor Halil Hasar is the Director of Climate Change and High-Level Representative of Turkey. We've got Audrey Nugent, the Director of Global Advocacy and Campaigns of World Green Building Council. Rogier Vandenberg, Global Cities Director, World Resources Institute, WRI. Engineer Ruvinis, Chairman of the Sri Lankan Construction Industry Development Authority. And we've got, last but not least, Nandra Kenya Green Building Society. Fantastic. Thank you, and welcome to the stage, everybody. Again, we're going to do the same format. We're going to run through some questions, and then depending how time goes, hopefully we can also have a little engagement, interaction with the audience, and hopefully we sparked a few questions. I can see our hands up at the end there, so let's hope we get the same again. So the first question is going to Halil Hasar. How has the creation of a roadmap helped you to implement actions to achieve your ambitions to reduce your emissions from buildings? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just before starting my speech, I want to emphasize one point about the circumstances of Turkey. So, as you know, last year on the same day, we experienced 2 big devastating earthquakes. So these are disasters, yes, okay. And also we have thousands loss of lives as well. And we have thousands of the destroyed buildings. So actually, I think sometimes disasters cause some, open some roads, and now recently all government are planning to build about more than 1 million buildings, individual buildings. So in this case, for the roadmap, actually, if we look at this point, the roadmap is very important to enhance our NDCs actions as well. And actually, if we rebuild the buildings, considering the energy efficiency and many kinds of the climate change and climate and environmental friendly actions, so we can receive some good outputs. So, as the building sector accounts for 20% of energy consumption in Turkey, and it is based on the responsible for 15% of energy related emissions. So if we would like to mitigate the emissions, to reduce the emissions related to atmosphere by heating and cooling, so we can get an opportunity and a solution for enhancing the reduction of the emissions coming from the building and construction sectors. So, as a result, we discussed these points in our presidency and climate change presidency of Turkey, and we under the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization, and Climate Change. So this minister has covers the three important divisions, and we can easily connect to each other, and we can easily find some solutions for ambitions in the next NDCs. So yes, we have a roadmap for the decarbonisation of buildings. So in this case, we just haven't just one roadmap, because there is some institution in Turkey which are urbanization division of under our ministry, and another one is energy ministries, and also in our climate change presidency also we consider all things. We consider all sectors to mitigate the emissions, because we are struggling to reach some targets, because Turkey announced their net zero emissions by 2053. So in this case, we need to take some actions for the 2030s as well. And the energy, the Ministry of Energy released a roadmap for the energy efficiency for all sectors, and one is related to buildings. So in this case, they first of all, we are planning some strategies and action plans to be implemented by other institutions. So after that, our main strategy, which is named mitigation strategy and action plan. So after that, the energy ministry released to a big roadmap, and they announced we will receive 30% of emissions reduction by 2030s. So I think it's enough for first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. Audrey, you've done a lot of work on whole life carbon roadmaps. Can you please tell us more about the importance of using a whole life approach to developing roadmaps to identify NDC objectives and actions for their implementation?
Sure. So thank you for the question. So at World Green Building Council, for a very long time, we've been advocating an approach to policy that addresses the whole life carbon of the building. And specifically in Europe, we've been doing a lot of advocacy that the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which up to date has only covered operational energy efficiency, should look at aspects beyond that and cover and take a whole life cycle approach. So over the past sort of 7 years, I've been doing that advocacy, but about 3 years ago, we started a project called Building Life. And what Building Life does is it brings together our community at a regional level, so in Europe, so towards the Brussels sort of machine, but also that our GBCs, Green Building Councils across Europe, are also bringing together industry stakeholders, policy and local policy makers to come together and co-create whole life carbon roadmaps. So the output of that was that we had 12 national roadmaps and 1 regional roadmap, which was recommendations as to how whole life carbon policy could be integrated into the EPBD. And I think it speaks to the points that some of the first panelists were making, that one of the most important factors in creating these roadmaps is really bringing together that community that there is within the sector and bringing together the different parts of the value chain. Because, you know, the sector we work in is complicated, the conversations can get tricky, but actually by bringing together a community and bringing them on that journey, you're able to actually really understand the differences, the nuance, and you can collectively come together and say, well, this is what we think is needed from a policy perspective, because the roadmaps were about policy. And then what you're able to do is give that confidence to legislators that you've brought together this community, they are behind it, and that means that you can actually get impactful change. So for me, I used to get kind of a bit existential crisis, like what is a roadmap? Because I talk about it constantly. But actually for me, it's like what Lola said, it's more than the paper it's created, it's about the outcomes that you can get from it. And I think that's the learnings that we should really be bringing into kind of the NDC process. How do you bring together the community? How do you sort of be open and be ready to be challenged on what your assumptions are? Because I was responsible for the EU roadmap development, and I was very tunnel vision at the start. We were doing whole life carbon only. But by bringing in a wider sector, we realised, you know, we needed to look at the circularity aspects, to procurement, to finance. So I think you need to be open to that as well. And I think, you know, in terms of the NDC cycle, the previous question I asked the previous panel, I think it's really important that we're bringing that sort of dialogue into discussions as we look to Brazil and, you know, the kind of intermediary point in Azerbaijan. And I think if we can do that and figure out a way that, you know, NDCs aren't just these sort of tools that sit on the shelf, but they're actually helping us to create better policy environments and enabling environments in countries that leads to real change that we've been hearing about. I think that would be a really important lesson to bring into that development.
Great, thank you, Georgie. Good, nice perspective. Yes, yes, it's a slightly different perspective as well, actually, that we're starting to hear now, and from that, the inclusive aspect as well, which we can talk about a bit at the end, maybe. Roger, the WRI has worked to support several countries and local governments to develop roadmaps. Can you please tell us more details about the similarities and differences between developing roadmaps at these two levels? What's the relationship between them, and how can local governments help achieve NDCs through implementation at the local level?
I can talk very long and very detailed, but I know that's not the intention of this meeting. So I think very much building on the first speaker and the second. I think just before I start on the roadmaps, I think this idea of multi-level governance is crucial if we're talking about NDCs. This is the topic that multi-level governance can be very fluffy, right? It can be extremely talk-shoppy, kind of nothing concrete, right? And this is why you really need to think on how you set targets and develop roadmaps and plans at the national level, linked to action plans at the local level. And this is what we've done, and as you described, this is what we've done together with the government of Turkey, but also in Colombia. We've been working in Costa Rica and India and in Kenya, and you will say something about that later on. But linking these two, so the national roadmap and the local action plan, I think is crucial. And that comes down, first of all, to a very structured approach. And these roadmaps, the zero carbon buildings roadmaps that we developed are talking about whole life cycle of the buildings. So they're organized around what is the current situation, which is the analysis, how does the construction sector work and look like, and then goes into what are the targets and the goals for the materials, existing and new buildings, to kind of distinct categories, energy, and now also adding the resilience and adaptation aspect to it. Thinking about short, medium, long term, well, there's a lot of policymakers here in the room, but being very specific in your categorization and in your short, medium, and long-term goals. And the trick that we invented, which is very simple, but it's difficult to kind of execute, is that these action plans, they follow the same categorization. So this is how you as a city can kind of tap into or can contribute to establishing the goals of the national roadmap. Of course, there are differences because, I mean, a country like Turkey is a big country and the climatological situations of cities are different. The building stock of cities is very different, right? To what extent is there historic and to what extent is existing building, new building. So it's really to the local authorities to kind of be specific on which part of the building stock goes first, how fast energy comes in, how important and how much kind of influence they can have on setting targets on material. So this is how these two things speak to each other. And maybe to end, because I think that is important, that every country also have a difference in innovation at the national versus the local level. So where we see in Turkey, you have very sophisticated performance-based certification. While in Colombia, that was actually not so much kind of anchored in the building code. So this is what we really managed to kind of anchor there, which means a lot for all new buildings in the whole country. So that's a huge push to decarbonization. Last, also, you need to be very specific in what are kind of new governance mechanisms. So for example, in Colombia, if you really want to bring local and national authorities together, in Colombia, we've been able to establish a high-level committee which brings in different ministries, but also brings in local authorities in a continuous conversation on how to deliver on this national roadmap and these kind of local action plans. Mm-hmm. So I think, well, I'll leave it here, and if you want to have much more detail, either I can answer it, and Meltem is also there, who kind of been working on that in the Turkey situation in detail. So thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much. Getting deeper into levels of complexity and hopefully making sense of that, I think is it's difficult, but it's actually maybe not that difficult. We're going to talk now quickly to Engineer Ravinis from a different perspective. The mission of the Sri Lankan Construction Industry Development Authority, which you represent, is to provide strategic leadership to the construction industry in fulfilling that role. How has having a roadmap to decarbonise the buildings and construction sector supported you? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, our role is to set the standards and regulation in place. Now, we were talking about the building code yesterday. We have started to prepare a new building code. Earlier days, we have been using the normal building specification, which is of little use nowadays. So we will have this building code ready by another 2 years' time. And also, our goal is to have this sector operate in a very transparent manner. If you look at the property development sector, which is an unregulated sector, we want to put that into a regulated setup so that we know what is going on. Especially, there's a Asia Pacific group monitoring what is happening in this sector in terms of the anti-money laundering and those activities. So right now, we are working on a roadmap with these aspects in mind, and also having the correct people doing this construction work is also paramount important. Unless you have the professional people who can do design, procurement, and supervision, then it is very difficult to expect a product which is of acceptable standards. So we have prepared prepared an act where we have specified a construction work which is more than $30,000 should only employ the recognized qualified people in design in terms of engineering, architecture, quantity surveying. And also the craftsmen, middle-level technical people, they should have sufficient capacity in terms of the relevant NVQ qualifications. That is the way we have to go ahead, because otherwise the design may be over design. We will use unnecessary resources. So that is one aspect of it. Then we have decided to put up the way we can reuse the construction material. Already there are some innovative people who has already started to produce those products. And also we have also started to have a green building rating procedure in place, and we will make 2 awards for each year for those who come up with the innovative solution in terms of the green building materials. And also the use of information secretariat. Now we should know what is going on in various sectors. Like now today we are talking about the building and construction sector. There are other sectors as well: agriculture, energy, transportation, and so on, sectors into this whole spectrum of having the carbon neutral by 2050. So we need to integrate all these sectors, and there are a lot of players in this area. The local government, the private sector, the NGOs, all will have to be integrated. Then we should know what is happening in each year, in each sector, and each action item that we have prepared in the roadmap. So having the information secretariat is also crucial step, and we have already established a system and database, and we will know what is happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. It's interesting we start off talking about codes and standards, and before long we're talking about professional qualifications and then education. It's again, demonstrating broadness. Nazra, thank you. As a private sector representative, from your perspective, why is it important to have a roadmap to support the implementation of the NDCs? And what would you like to see in a roadmap to improve the engagement of the private sector to support the shift to a more sustainable built environment?
Thank you. I think to answer your question, holistically, it's important for me to kind of set the tone and context. So why do we have NDC roadmaps? Essentially, NDC roadmaps are a strategic plan of how you will adapt, mitigate, manage your climate priorities. So from the Global South perspective, it's not just climate, but development. In Africa, you can't separate the two. And so with that in mind, essentially at the national level, what you're saying is, this is our plan, and this is how we will, mitigate, adapt to climate, but at the same time, ensure that development is prioritized in a very holistic manner, which is fusing both. Why is it important? It's important because this plan will allow you to understand what your climate vulnerabilities are. So that becomes now your priority areas of focus. In Kenya, if I were to highlight the top 3 off the top of my head, it would be affordable housing, building climate resilience for the urban poor, and then greening Kenya. So how does biodiversity work for cities in the context of the built environment? And why are we doing all these 3 things? It's because, one, at the heart of it, dignity is the development priority for Kenya, for its people. But separately, working with nature so that ultimately we ensure that there's a sense of giving back to nature and working with nature for 2 reasons. 1, it's the right thing to do, but 2, how can biodiversity unlock nature-based financing to empower cities, urban and peri-urban spaces? And lastly, when you think about building climate resilience for the urban poor, at the heart of it, aren't we doing it for people? Businesses will not thrive if people are not thriving, because businesses are run by people. So in that context, once you've identified your climate vulnerabilities, you've highlighted your priorities, and that then informs what you are intending to collaborate with regional, global, local, national players and partners. As a bloc, you know, in Africa, green and resilient cities are a priority in line with the AU. But separately, that's what positions you to have your diplomacy around climate and development issues. The third thing I think which is important is once you've identified your priorities, that's then how you can, you know, mobilize resources. You cannot have financing if you don't have an agenda. So that informs that agenda. And I think the last thing before I now transition into the private sector is once you have this aligned, then you can say we're going to create policies that enable us to achieve what we set out to do. How does private sector come in? It comes in because the private sector, or rather the informed and smart private sector, will look at an NDC and say, hey, these are the government's priorities. If we align ourselves to those priorities, it means as the government is sourcing for funding, as the government is, you know, gunning for priorities in specific sectors, this is how we complement government efforts. So you're working with the government to achieve both your perspectives, both your objectives. Second, I think, when it comes to risk, so if a government has decided housing is our agenda, chances are there'll be due diligence done. And the private sector then benefits from saving time and cost because the government would have done a due diligence in that particular area. So that means you as the private sector also save your time and your costs because you're aligned. And I think third, reputational, you know, benefits. If you're working for a government agenda or complementing a government agenda, there are many, many benefits to that in a local, national, and global capacity. So the private sector complementing these roadmaps creates an opportunity for private sector to not only create impact, but also profit in a way that complements local, national, and global perspectives. And then tying it to local governments, I have a bias because I'm from the Nairobi County. I think you cannot achieve NDCs alone as national government. Your local governments are essentially your foot soldiers on ground. They have access to communities that you as national government might not have the benefit of accessing. So they then have the localized relationships, whether it's in cities, whether it's in industries, to help you now trickle down your vision so that you have implementation at the heart of everything. And then tying it to our work as the Kenya Green Building Society with the World Resources Institute, we worked with Laikipia County government in what was called the Zero Carbon Accelerator Program, where we are essentially decarbonizing Laikipia County's built portfolio. And in line with what I just mentioned, what it does then is give them an opportunity to use the built environment to prioritize affordable housing, green jobs, and also create an avenue of also unpacking what green building guidelines look like so that way they have the policy to ensure that it incentivizes private sector, affordable housing in line with the national government's agenda, but most importantly, at the heart of a lot of governments are the fact that they need to create jobs. So in this context, you're doing green jobs, you're doing green policy, and you're also fulfilling an agenda. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Yes. A great set of perspectives, I think, and interesting how, you know, we're really talking about NDCs, but we're not talking about just national, we're talking about subnational. And most importantly, particularly from, as I just mentioned, the Global South perspective, we're talking about communities, we're talking about leaving no one behind, we're making sure that those most vulnerable in our populations are catered for in any action plans that we're putting together. Without that, then there is certainly limited development, or there's skewed development, which we're ending up with greater inequalities being faced. So thank you for that. I think now would be a nice time. We've got a couple of minutes. It'd be good to open the floor. I saw because there were a lot of hands before. I could see up on the last comment. Now we're talking about hopefully some of the same sort of things we had in the last session around challenges, but also we're broadening a little bit more around scope, depth as well. So anybody have any interesting questions they'd like to ask? I see one here and then one over there. Maybe Alicia, and then.
I can take it here very quickly. My question is for Audrey. You have been working in 12 roadmaps, and we as well have been working nationally and assisting Sri Lanka in the roadmaps and several ones. My question is, I saw some of your roadmaps had very detailed work in data and projections, so on how to work and how to achieve those numbers when countries put their ambitions and their alignment to NDCs. What will be your recommendation for other contexts where data is maybe more scarce, or how could you do that same approach? Because although I know you had data, it was also some work within the country to collect and develop some of this data, no?
I mean, absolutely. Data, I mean, if we just have had a report that looks at the analysis of the different roadmaps and the approach that the different countries took, or the different GBCs took, I should say, the Green Building Councils, and some took a carbon budget approach, which is it's probably what you're talking about, which is quite detailed, and the different types of ways that you can do that, and others just didn't feel like that they, had perhaps the data to do that. So I think that presents a huge challenge in terms of how you would actually, if you don't have that sort of sectoral or that level of data, it's going to be a challenge to do it in that way, and I think maybe that's actually maybe a call to action for us to figure out how do we get access to better data, so that we can get more robust NDCs, because it certainly is a challenge. And I think there is huge issues with data in Europe, and I think that will be replicated elsewhere. So yeah, it's not the easiest process for sure.
Thank you, Audrey. Anybody else like to take on that one before the next question? No? Yeah, please.
Because we have been primarily working on action plans, as you know, and roadmaps in the Global South, and I think there's quite a, to what extent the Global South is a good definition, but they're quite different. There's a lot of difference in data availability and data capabilities. I do think, and WR is a very data-savvy organization. There are places where there's very poor data capacity and availability. There is a lot that we can work from. And I think the question now, with the urgency that's upon us, it is what is good enough to set your priorities and get started. And I think in many cases we are able, with sufficient granularity, to provide that data. Biggest challenge often is the socioeconomic part of the data. A lot needs to happen there in order to kind of bring that in, besides the more kind of geophysical data.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we heard it a couple of times in the last couple of days. Don't let perfect get in the way of good. Get started, I think, is a key message.
Andrew Minson from the Global Cement and Concrete Association. I'm interested in, we're all here, which is great. We're really complex. And when it comes to NDCs, are we right to try and put everything under a buildings NDC, which is great if we are, or do we split it up? Now, to my specific question, I guess, but I guess that general question hopefully appeals to lots of people. My specific is, on the cement and concrete sector, we've got a global roadmap, which we've now got national roadmaps, and those national roadmaps were strategically done in different parts of the globe. So even if a country doesn't have a national roadmap today or in coming months, they'll be able to look over the border to a similar country and maybe learn some lessons from their roadmap. Should we be looking to do NDCs at the cement and concrete sector, beside the buildings NDCs, but cognizant of what the building is, or should we be trying to work underneath a building umbrella NDC?
That's cat amongst the pigeons question there. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very pertinent one, and we did hear from UAE in the earlier session around they're looking across sectoral in their planning. So, anybody like to take that?
I mean, I get it's quite a complex question, so it's going to be hard to answer. But I think my initial reaction, I mean, I talked about whole life carbon, didn't I? So I guess my answer is going to kind of maybe focus on that a roadmap should look at the whole life carbon approach, and then you're kind of capturing, obviously, the materials emissions as well. And I guess, again, just going back to this is again an initial reaction, but I guess going back to the kind of complexity, of the sector that we work in, perhaps adding another, because then you would have to do that for other materials, I would assume. So I don't know if that would, it might just make it a bit complicated. But I'm open to be challenged.
Yeah, I'd like to say I think you need to be flexible enough. At least I'll just share my Global South perspective. I think you have more traction if you look at the built environment as an ecosystem of challenges and opportunities that you're trying to realize. So I would perhaps propose a built environment roadmap because it looks at that ecosystem. And then don't be so fixed on form. I think focus first on the substance of what you're trying to achieve together. And then as you kind of start seeing where you fit in, as an industry, you could say specifically, this is what we're trying to achieve, but it's more important to say, how do we fit into the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve? Because that way then it's more holistic, inclusive, and collaborative. Thank you.
Can I just respond on that?
Very quickly,
Yeah, I will do.
yes.
I really like those, and I'm a structural engineer in a materials industry, and whole life and collaborative, I totally get. There are some key policies that we need, and I'm sure other people in the room know the key policies that they might need from government. And to actually get as sharp and pointy to get those policies, you maybe need to get sharp and pointy in rather than being whole life and collaborative. And I think that's where the stretch and the challenge is. If we always go at the big level, which for great reasons you've explained, we might end up with some sharp and pointy policies that actually get action in the specific areas. But if people want to talk about this more, I'd love to talk to you more about it, because we should try and solve this.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way, and unfortunately, an interesting way to end this session, because it's left a lot of questions unanswered and hanging, but really important. I think, firstly, I just want to say thank you so much again to our panelists and bringing their knowledge and experience. Thank you very much for your time and effort. There is much more to do and talk about, but more importantly, there's much more action to be defined and done. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Just very quickly before everybody leaves, I mean, we've got literally 2 minutes. I just wanted to point out we've had a lot of good conversations here. I think we've heard a lot of, we would like to, I think, some of us like to hear a lot more. I just want to say that this tool that's being developed with Global ABC, UNOPS, UNEP, funded by the German government under the Global ABC, is having a lot of these conversations with a lot of different stakeholders, bringing good examples of practice, looking at roadmaps, how they're put together, learning and understanding. It's ongoing, and if anybody would like to be involved more in this, please feel free to find out more. Get in touch with us through the Global ABC and be involved. We've heard from the first session about being more involved in some of these global forums and bringing our expertise. And only by crowdsourcing a diverse range of opinions and experiences can we ensure that we make this a success. So my last plea was you of that. Otherwise, thank you very much for being a great audience, and thank you.